So for tonight, I'm going to be presenting some new work, actually, on racial reconciliation. I am a womanist theologian who has spent about the past 12 or so years hanging out with evangelical social justice types who are really committed to justice and reconciliation. And in that space, as you can imagine, I'm often in the position of being the yes, but person, or coming to that moment where I think, why am I here? And so I've been working through what is going on in the racial reconciliation movement and some real failures I see in it. And at the same time, I'm not quite willing to let the concept of reconciliation go, in that it is pivotal to how I see my work as a pastoral theologian in doing the work of healing and reconciliation of people with God, with themselves, and with their neighbor. So for this first talk, it is entitled, I Need Freedom Too, How Racial Reconciliation Fails Black Women. So in the past 2 decades, racial reconciliation has emerged as an increasingly popular topic of academic discourse in both the United States and in South Africa. An inherently practical discipline, the field of reconciliation studies was birthed out of the daily experiences of ministers and lay people whose ministry crossed traditional boundaries of race and ethnicity within the church, which still remains 50 years after King said it, one of the most segregated institutions in the United States. In the U.S. in particular, reconciliation has largely been framed as a movement aimed at obliterating racial barriers between African American and white men. The early literature in this area consisted primarily of autobiographical narratives of division, partnership, and friendship between Black and white men. For example, John Perkins and Wayne Gordon, Glenn Carine and Riley Washington, Spencer Perkins and Chris Rice. And as the field developed into an academic discipline, this masculine preponderance has continued. The leading scholars in the field have included J.D. Otis Roberts, Curtis Paul DeYoung, Alan Bosak, John Paul Lederach, Chris Rice, and Emmanuel Katongole. With just a few exceptions, women's voices are largely absent, and feminist and womanist perspectives in particular are utterly unheard. Now, the patriarchal bias in racial reconciliation is neither incidental nor accidental. The movement, at least since the 1970s, has been heavily rooted in evangelical Christian traditions. Now, the evangelical roots of the movement are beneficial in that it has been first and foremost concerned with practical application. The same roots, however, tie the movement to evangelical beliefs about male headship and female submission. The result is a body of literature that examines race as a singular construct, ignoring the intersections between race, gender, and sexuality. It is a body of literature and an approach to ministry that repeatedly and unavoidably fails Black women and other women of color. In the U.S., the surge in interest in racial reconciliation can be traced to movements in several evangelical organizations during the mid-90s. There were a few earlier incidences and occasions that set the stage for this. For example, Tom Skinner gave a landmark address at InterVarsity's Urbana Conference in 1970. What is distinguishable about the 90s, however, is that several national and international evangelical organizations made racial reconciliation a prominent focus of their work. The most high-profile effort occurred within Promise Keepers, a predominantly white evangelical men's organization founded in 1990 by former University of Colorado football coach Bill McCartney. Promise Keepers called upon men to commit themselves to 7 promises, the 6 of which focused on racial unity. It stated, "A promise keeper is committed to reaching beyond any racial and denominational barriers to demonstrate the power of biblical unity." The racial reconciliation focus in Promise Keepers was not just a matter of rhetoric. The organization actually put some substantial resources and support behind it. In 1996, for example, Raleigh, Washington, an African-American pastor, was appointed vice president to head a newly instituted reconciliation division. And Washington was not hired as sort of a singular token diversity representative. At its height, Promise Keepers was probably the most diversely staffed evangelical Christian organization in the country, perhaps one of the most diverse Christian organizations in the country. 30% of its 437 member staff were people of color, primarily African American, Latino, and Native American. The Reconciliation Division was charged with developing educational curricula, including the 8 biblical principles of reconciliation, and also with dispersing over $1 million that Promise Keepers raised for mostly Black churches that had been burned by arson. Reconciliation was not a tangential project for Promise Keepers either. It was at the core of its programming. At its 22 stadium rallies in the summer of 1996, thousands of evangelical men, possibly for the first time, heard that racial reconciliation was not only valued, but also mandated by the gospel. In the fall of 1997, after a year of intentionally working to diversify Promise Keeper audiences, the organization held its most ambitious event, a national gathering of men focused on repentance and prayer in Washington, D.C. Standing before 500,000 men on the National Mall on October 4th, 1997, Bill McCartney declared a lofty goal of eradicating racism in the church by 2000. Now, obviously, his goal was just a little bit naive. It turned out that not only could he not end racism in the church within 3 years, he couldn't even convince enough white Christian men that that was a worthy goal. Attendance at Promise Keepers events plummeted by more than 50% in the year following. Pretty soon thereafter, the movement that once dominated media attention vanished from the view of most Americans. If you recall, during the 90s, there were news stories about Promise Keepers all the time, and then suddenly there weren't. Bill McCartney attributes that heightened emphasis on racial reconciliation to that. Despite, though, and Promise Keepers still exists, you can go on the website, they're still doing things, but they have nowhere near the power and influence that they held in the 90s. Despite this decreased prominence, however, Promise Keepers continues to exert a strong impact upon the evangelical approach to racial reconciliation, in part because of the sheer size of the organization at its zenith, but also because of the ties between it and other organizations that continue to have explicit emphases on reconciliation. For example, one of the most prominent of these is the Christian Community Development Association. Leaders at CCDA were frequent speakers at Promise Keepers rallies, including the founder of CCDA, John Perkins, its current president, Noel Castellanos. Raleigh, Washington, who I mentioned earlier, pastored a congregation that had a strategic relationship with a ministry, with the CCDA ministry, founded by one of CCDA's board members, Glenn Carine. John Perkins was a mentor for one of the African-American women who has written in this area, Brenda Salter McNeil, who was a former InterVarsity staff person who spoke at their Urbana 2000 conference on racial reconciliation. And InterVarsity Press is today the most frequent publisher of books on racial reconciliation and also a very frequent sponsor of evangelical conferences on reconciliation. So they sponsor CCDA's national conference. They are a big sponsor of Sojourners, a big sponsor of the Justice Conference. And so that all of these movements and these organizations are interwoven together. So the theology of racial reconciliation that emerged through Promise Keepers was shaped by the dominant evangelical paradigm. And central to this paradigm was an understanding of racism as a form of sin resulting from division based upon socially constructed categories of identity. More specifically, the evangelical paradigm of racial reconciliation relies on what is called a symmetrical treatment approach to race, racism, and reconciliation. The symmetrical treatment argument follows along these lines. First, race is socially constructed, that is, it is a human rather than a divine creation. 2, race obscures God's intentions for humanity, therefore it is sinful. 3, all racial categories are equally sinful, that is, blackness is as problematic as whiteness. 4, the solution is for black people to stop seeing themselves as black, for white people to stop seeing themselves as white, and for all of us to see ourselves as Christians. And 5, the way we do this is through increased social contact, namely through interracial relationships and worshiping in the same congregations. So consistent with evangelical emphasis upon Christian identity being expressed through the individual believer's relationship with God, the evangelical understanding of reconciliation focuses on the establishment of transformed interpersonal relationships between Christians of different ethnic backgrounds and the establishment of racially diverse congregations. To put it more simply, in the evangelical paradigm, the central problem of racism is separation. The solution is togetherness. The reduction of racial reconciliation to interpersonal relationships presents a particular problem when confronted with gender. In the evangelical worldview, women are seen primarily as wives, mothers, and daughters. That is, they are extensions of men rather than human beings and leaders in their own right. Evangelicals really see male identity as constituting the basic human experience. Likewise, male racial identity is seen as constituting the basic racial experience. Women are not seen as raced human beings. That is, they are not imagined as having experiences of race and racism that are distinct from their male counterparts. This is why Bill McCartney was able to imagine that friendship between men of different races could single-handedly eradicate the problem of racism because men were all that mattered. This exclusion has resulted in some really critical failures in the dominant understandings of race, racism, and reconciliation among evangelicals. Historically, women's bodies have been the sites upon which racial boundaries have been policed and racial wars have been fought. Two of the primary ways by which white supremacist patriarchy has exercised its power has been by controlling what white women could do with their bodies and who they could do it with, and by rendering black women's bodies inviolable, unrapeable, right? The synergy between racism and patriarchy means that women, especially black women and other women of color, experience and understand racism in ways that are unique from men and that shed further light upon the dynamics of racism and racial justice. For example, simply including the narrative centered upon black women would immediately problematize the prevailing idea that social contact between blacks and whites is the primary mechanism for eliminating racism. After all, black women have had contact with white women since we arrived in chains upon these shores. Throughout most of U.S. history, black women have nursed and nurtured white babies from childhood until adulthood, brushed the hair and slept at the bedsides of white mistresses, cooked the meals and cleaned the homes of white families, taken care of elderly white women and men in nursing homes, assisted living facilities, and hospice care. And none of that intimacy has protected black women from racist abuse. Indeed, it often exposes us to more. In any society, it is the most marginalized people who best understand the rules of the system because they need to know the politics and dynamics to avoid being crushed by them. Black women and other women of color, especially our queer, disabled, immigrant, and poor sisters, are often the marginalized among the marginalized. Our very survival depends upon knowing how the isms work. We are constantly bending and genuflecting in order to fit into the small, contorted spaces that society has set for us. We are frequently hurting from the injuries that occur when we dare to step out of place. And we are always aware that others, men of color as well as white women, do not have to bend and sidestep in the same ways or to the same degrees. We thus have unique vantage points from which to view how the system works. In marginalizing the voices of Black women, the racial reconciliation movement not only fails us, it fails itself. The focus upon race as an illegitimate construct is particularly taking on much stronger root among evangelicals. So they tend to view racism as a social division based upon race. That is, racism occurs when people align and separate themselves based on their affinity for people of the same race and their hostility towards people of other races. A popular way to put this has been racism equals prejudice plus power. That is, it's the idea that racism is about having the personal power to act out on one's feelings about racial difference. This understanding reduces racism to the level of affect and interpersonal relationships. Racism occurs because of how we as individuals feel about other ethnic groups. Reconciliation, on the other hand, occurs when we eliminate our negative feelings about other racial groups and establish relationships across race. But racism is not about our feelings, nor is it about the attitudes, intentions, or behavior of individuals. Racism is an interlocking system of oppression that is designed to promote and maintain white supremacy. The notion that white people, including their bodies, aesthetics, beliefs, values, cultures, and customs, are inherently superior to all other races and therefore should wield dominion over the rest of creation, including other people groups, the animal kingdom, and the earth itself. White supremacy is a systematic way of ordering societal systems, ideologies, and relationships such that political, economic, cultural, and social dominance accrues to whites. It exists independent of any individual person's feelings towards people of other races. Because the term white supremacy has become identified with terrorists and hate groups, people rarely use it in discussing racism and reconciliation, instead opting to use the less harsh term white privilege. But white privilege exists because of white supremacy. White privilege consists of the advantages inherent in being categorized as white in a society that views whiteness as superior. Integration of womanist and feminist perspectives would not only help us to understand that, but it would reveal another important aspect of racism. Racism is not one size fits all. The evangelical paradigm is similar to a lot of anti-racist organizing in that it uses a single-axis approach to understanding identity. Now, our identities are always multi-layered. That means none of us exist as just a raced person. Our identities are complex combinations of race, class, gender identity, sexual orientation, nationality, geographic origin, disability, religion, and so on. In pastoral theology, we often talk about this as multiplicity. Multiplicity argues that who I am culturally is a complex interplay of the various categories or layers that make up my identity. In my case, for example, I am a middle-class, highly educated African-American Christian woman who was raised in a working-class family in the Deep South. Multiplicity helps us to understand the different layers that make up our cultural identity, including those layers that seem to oppose one another. For example, my middle-class existence, my working-class background. While multiplicity is meant to encompass the complexity of identity, it far too often implies that identity is additive. And this is also what the racial reconciliation movement does. In other words, it sees my experiences as an African American woman as the sum total of my experiences as an African American and my experiences as a woman. It says we're always race and gendered, but that in varying contexts, one or more layer may kind of rise to the foreground as being more important. For example, in a predominantly white environment, my blackness may be what stands out more. If I'm in France, my Americanness stands out more. So this sort of approach and understanding of identity underlies the tendency in a lot of anti-racist and anti-sexist organizing to treat race and gender as mutually exclusive domains that can be engaged separately from one another. When women of color are engaged in anti-racist work, including racial reconciliation with our male colleagues, we are often expected to assume a race-first, gender-second mentality. In other words, to relegate the non-raced layers of our identity to the background. Where we are engaged in anti-sexist work with our white female peers, we are expected to do the same thing with gender, focusing upon the universal experience of womanhood, as if such a thing exists. Both of these represent what we call single-axis frameworks, and both are highly problematic for women of color. In contrast, womanist scholars use the term intersectionality to describe how race and gender, and likewise how racism and sexism, interact to shape Black women's identities, experiences, and needs. Intersectionality recognizes that the layers of our identities are neither discrete nor separable. They are fused. There is no such thing as an unraced layer. Every layer is raced. Every layer is gendered, and so on. Thus, as an African American, it is true that I share some aspects of my experience with African American men and some aspects of my experience with all women, but there are also unique experiences that I have by virtue of my Black womanness. This means that I am not only a target of racism and sexism, I am also a target of gendered racism and racialized sexism. And then other layers of my identity, my class, my sexuality, my nationality, further attenuate those experiences of oppression and privilege. Intersectionality's core insight, then, is that the major axes of social divisions in a given society at a given time operate not as discrete and mutually exclusive entities, but build on each other and work together. Inherently, then, intersectionality is more than about identity. It is about systemic inequality and the way in which oppressive structures intersect to uniquely impact the lives of those who live at their intersection. Intersectionality is not neutral. It is always concerned with and biased towards justice. Feminist scholar Vivian May discusses intersectionality as a form of resistant knowledge, developed to unsettle conventional mindsets, challenge oppressive power, think through the full architecture of structural inequalities and asymmetrical life opportunities, and seek a more just world. Kimberly Crenshaw, the legal scholar and critical race theorist who initially coined the term intersectionality as a way of describing Black women's approaches to scholarship and organizing, she identifies three forms of intersectionality. I'm just going to talk about one of these: political intersectionality. Political intersectionality has to do with the ways in which feminist and anti-racist organizing marginalizes the issues of women of color. This concept of political intersectionality is especially critical for racial reconciliation and gender egalitarian movements among Christians, as both movements tend to ignore or minimize the unique needs and experiences of women of color. May states, the concept of political intersectionality highlights the fact that women of color are situated within at least two subordinated groups that frequently pursue conflicting political agendas. The need to split one's political energies between two, sometimes opposing groups is a dimension of intersectional disempowerment that men of color and white women seldom confront. Because women of color experience racism in ways not always the same as those experienced by men of color, and sexism in ways not always parallel to experiences of white women, anti-racism and feminism are limited even on their own terms. The failure of feminism to interrogate race means that the resistance strategies of feminism will often replicate and reinforce the subordination of people of color. And the failure of anti-racism to interrogate patriarchy means that anti-racism will frequently reproduce the subordination of women. Likewise, I argue that racial reconciliation's failure to interrogate patriarchy means that it will frequently reproduce the subordination of women of color. To put it bluntly, much of what passes for racial reconciliation among Christians is merely an exercise in making sure that Black men and other men of color have the same access to male privilege as their white male counterparts do. Racism and sexism, after all, have the same ultimate aim, the preservation of white supremacist heteropatriarchy. We cannot address one without the other, and intersectionality is the meta-framework that allows us to do this. So again, intersectionality says that racism is not one size fits all, that racism is gendered. In other words, our gender identities dispose us to different manifestations of racism. Sometimes this takes the form of experiences that are unique to certain racial gender groups. Other times it takes the form of experiences that disproportionately impact a racial gender group. So the patriarchal bias of racial reconciliation and a lot of racial justice movements means that they have exclusively or disproportionately emphasized the forms of racism that are meted out against African American and Latinx men, such as lynching, police brutality, and driving while Black. All of those are forms of gendered racism that occur to women of color, but they occur disproportionately to men of color. To say that women and men of color experience different forms of racism does not mean that either group is somehow more disadvantaged by racism than the other. Any form of oppression meted out against one segment of a racial ethnic group necessarily affects, even indirectly, other members of that group. For example, James Cone talked about this in The Cross and the Lynching Tree. He talked about lynching as disproportionately affecting Black men. Only Black women represented about 2% of Blacks killed by lynching, but they were still targets of their impact, and that Black women had to live with the loss of sons and husbands and brothers and uncles and nephews and cousins. They had to endure economic hardship, emotional loss as a result of carrying on with families in the aftermath of lynching. Cone resists the common tendency to measure the comparative suffering of Black women and Black men, noting that while their experiences were different because of gender, neither was necessarily harder or easier than the other. He stated, in a patriarchal white society defined by lynching and state-sponsored executions, it was not easy for any Black to survive with dignity, especially Black men. Yet, although Black women's struggles for survival might have been somewhat different from those of Black men, they were not any easier. So the aim of describing gendered racism is not to produce a sort of oppression Olympics or a race to the bottom in which groups jockey for the position of the most marginalized. Rather, considering how different groups experience racism gives us a more comprehensive understanding of how racism operates. Patricia Hill Collins says, although it is tempting to claim that Black women are more oppressed than everyone else and therefore has the best standpoint from which to understand the mechanisms, processes, and effects of oppression, this is not the case. Instead, those ideas that are validated as true by African American women, African American men, Latina lesbians, Asian American women, Puerto Rican men, and other groups with distinctive standpoints, with each group using the epistemological approaches growing from its unique standpoint, become the most objective truth. Each group speaks from its own standpoint and shares its own partial situated knowledge. But because each group perceives its own truth as partial, its knowledge is unfinished. Each group becomes better able to consider other groups' standpoint without relinquishing the uniqueness of its own standpoint. So in contrast to the symmetrical treatment approach to analyzing oppression, it is through perceiving and considering racism's partiality that we are better able to understand and combat it. This includes the forms of gendered racism that are commonly experienced by women of color. And I'm going to give one example of this, which is colorism. How many people have heard of colorism or know what it is? All right, a few people. All right. So colorism is an extension of racism that measures beauty and worth based upon proximity to white aesthetic norms. Rooted in European racial ideology, colorism offers privilege to individuals and groups whose skin color, hair, and facial body features more closely approximate whiteness. Now, in many cultures, the association between light skin and social value began as a product of the association between class and outdoor labor. Individuals with class privilege were exempt from outdoor labor, from manual labor, and thus they tended to have fairer complexions than those from the lower rungs of society. This is what underlies the use of the term redneck to refer to poor and working class whites, right? It is rooted in this kind of historic distinction where a tanned and sunburnt neck, literally a red neck, was a marker of someone who labored outside. So even prior to colonialism, Western Europeans associated lightness with civility, intelligence, purity, and beauty. But colonization and slavery further cemented the color hierarchy, especially in the U.S. From the late 1600s until the late 1800s, white skin in the U.S. was synonymous with freedom. To be white was to be free. To be black was to be enslaved or enslavable. Therefore, a racial hierarchy was established whereby racial groups and individuals within these groups are adjudicated based on their proximity to whiteness. Even after the Civil War, skin color continued to determine basic life circumstances, from the daily experience of which water fountain to use to the larger issue of voting rights. So consequently, the task of every immigrant group to the Americas since the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade has been inscribing themselves closer to the white end of the color line. It is no coincidence then that Eastern European immigrants have been the driving force behind the cosmetics industry, or that black women spend more on cosmetics and hair care than do any other group. When by accident of birth we fall far from the hegemonic beauty ideal, it seems we are more likely to use artificial means to approximate it. Colorism, like racism, is a fundamentally theological issue in that it positions white racial identity and white aesthetics as the standard of judging human beauty and human worth. Whiteness and white people then become bearers of the imago Dei, and God's personhood becomes defined by colorism's unholy trinity of skin, hair, and body features. Now, colorism is most strongly associated with skin tone, which makes sense because it's usually through skin color that we infer or determine a person's racial identity. When we see somebody as black or white or Asian American or Latinx, it is because we make a superficial judgment, right? We don't ask them about their history. We look and we make that judgment, usually based on skin tone. Colorism further distinguishes between members of the same racial group by making judgments about a person's beauty, personality, and behavior based on the lightness or darkness of their skin. The relationship between perceived skin tone and objective markers of social prestige is so strong that many scholars argue that skin tone, together with other factors such as education, is becoming more important than racial identity. It forms a new system of racial inequality that is based upon social stratification rather than racial distance per se. Eduardo Bonilla Silva says, colorism practices, if not thwarted, will result in the United States becoming a pigmentocracy, where whiteness is on the top and blackness, broadly defined to include other dark-skinned non-whites, is on the bottom. In the middle will be a broad and changing group of non-whites, light-skinned Asian, Latinx, black, and bi- or multiracial individuals whose quest for whiteness will reinforce this country's persistent ideology of white privilege. The irony of this new pigmentocracy is that it will reinforce the supremacy of whiteness even as the country becomes less white. On the surface, it will appear that race is no longer a fundamental determinant of life chances and that class has a larger impact, the white supremacist underpinnings of the hierarchy will be obscured. Now, while most strongly associated with skin tone, colorism also includes hair and facial or body features. That is, as a function of white supremacy, colorism elevates and values white and Anglo aesthetics so that positive traits are associated with whiteness and negative traits are associated with blackness or indigeneity. Thus, colorism favors individuals whose hair and facial or body features approximate those of white Western European standards, particularly light skin tone, light eyes, aquiline noses, thin lips, and long straight hair. At the opposite end of its hierarchy are individuals with dark skin, kinky hair, thick lips, and broad noses. In fact, hair texture, eye color, facial features can even impact society's perception of who is considered light-skinned. So, for example, under the apartheid system in South Africa, hair texture was a key determinant in assigning people to the country's racial categories. The pencil test was often used to determine whether a person was native, meaning black, or colored, which was associated with differing privileges and rights in the country. Essentially, they would put a pencil in a person's hair. If the pencil fell, meaning the hair could not hold the pencil, the person would more than likely be assigned colored. If the pencil held, because African hair being more curly, would hold the pencil, then that person was assigned native or black. And in this very random way, families were split up, so children might be assigned to a different racial group than their parents or their siblings. We see now the preference for white aesthetics is not just an American or an African diasporic thing, but it is a worldwide issue. In countries that with long histories of light skin preferences, such as Japan and China, increasing commercial trade with the West has meant that colorism is not just about having light skin, but about having Western European features. So today, Asians and Asian Americans account for a large part of the growth in the plastic surgery market. Worldwide, the third most common procedure is the creation of a double eyelid to make eyes appear larger. Many of our Asian and Asian American news anchors, actresses, actors have had this surgery. Among immigrant women, often attempting to reach the standards of feminine beauty often requires dieting, hair straightening, bleaching, shaping the nose. So colorism is about achieving the appearance of Western white middle-class status. Other places in the world, we see this in the popularity of skin bleaching creams. India is the largest market for skin bleaching creams. The top sellers are companies like Vaseline and Garnier and L'Oreal. And then also Africa. In Nigeria, it's estimated that up to 77% of adult women use skin lightening creams. Colorism now, so I talk about colorism as disproportionately affecting women. It affects all people of color, but because of its association with beauty and the value that's placed upon women's beauty in a patriarchal society, it disproportionately impacts women of color. White supremacy, after all, does not just say whiteness is superior to all other racial ethnic identities. It maintains that a certain form of whiteness is a hegemonic standard, especially as the icon of beauty. Fair skin, blue eyes, long, blonde, straight hair. All women, regardless of race, struggle against that hegemonic standard. The distinction for women of color is that our racial ethnic skin tone, hair texture and length, facial and body features often place us not just at a distance from the hegemonic ideal, but in an entirely different universe. It makes sense then that Black women in America spend more per capita on cosmetics and hair products, including the weaves and wigs made from synthetic hair or from the hair of women in Malaysia, India, and Brazil, than any other racial gender group. African American women spend $7.5 billion annually on beauty products. That's 80% more on cosmetics and twice as much on skincare than the general market. And while it would be overgeneralizing to state that all cosmetics are designed to approximate whiteness, it is probably safe to assume that many of us are trying to relax, weave, and make up our way into some section of the hegemonic ideal. And we do this for good reason too. In a patriarchal capitalist society, conforming to hegemonic beauty ideals has tangible consequences across a wide variety of domains, including education, employment, marriage, and the criminal justice system. In the U.S., people who are perceived as physically attractive are considered more intelligent by their teachers, or more popular among their classmates, are more likely to be hired, have higher earnings, receive better performance evaluations, are promoted more often, and receive less severe punishments in criminal justice proceedings. And while men and women both benefit from attractiveness, attractive women have the added advantage of marrying higher status men. And women who engage in beauty work, wearing makeup, choosing flattering outfits, dieting, undergoing cosmetic surgery, earn 34 to 50% more than women who do not. Colorism is linked to our understandings of beauty. And research on colorism in the U.S. has found the following disparities among Blacks in America alone. Dark-skinned Blacks have lower individual and family income, higher rates of unemployment and poverty, lower educational attainment, and higher occupational prestige than do lighter-skinned Blacks, even when controlling for factors that might account for the difference. For example, most Blacks in leadership roles within corporate and government institutions are light in skin tone, as are most tenured and tenure-track professors at U.S. universities. Darker-skinned Blacks are arrested, incarcerated, and even sentenced to death row at higher rates than lighter-skinned Blacks when controlling for offense type. Dark-skinned Blacks receive longer sentences and serve more of their sentences than do whites or light-skinned Blacks. Among children, in schools, African American females with dark skin are suspended at twice the rate of white girls and light-skinned African American girls. Again, the disparity remains even after you control for behavior, for school type, for school setting, for student characteristics. Among heterosexual African Americans, lighter-skinned women marry higher status partners, that is, men with higher educations and income. So when beauty results in kind of tangible and social economic advantages, and it's also tied to ideals that are rooted in white supremacy, the impact upon women of color is striking. Women of color with light skin and European features have more racial and social capital, to use Margaret Hunter's term. She says light skin operates as a form of social capital for women because it represents beauty, and conversely, beauty is a form of social capital. Light-skinned women convert their beauty defined by European aesthetics into social capital in the forms of economic, educational, and general prestige. In contrast, women of color with darker skin and indigenous features are more likely to experience more racial and gender hostility and oppression. The gendered nature of colorism and the particularity of anti-Black racism means that Black women and girls pay even higher penalties for having dark skin than do women of other ethnic groups or African American men. Despite, however, the profound impact of colorism in explaining some of our racial disparities, colorism has largely been ignored by the racial reconciliation movement. It's never talked about. It is usually treated as an intra-ethnic issue, a form of pathology that's created by ethnic minority groups and inflicted upon ourselves. Yet colorism is an extension of white supremacy that is produced and reinforced through social, educational, and economic systems that confer privilege to those with lighter skin and European features, while simultaneously demonizing, punishing, and controlling those with darker skin and indigenous features. evidence indicates that the U.S. is well on its way to becoming a triracial pigmentocracy, with skin tone interacting with race and sometimes outweighing it to impact educational achievement, occupational prestige, income, marriage patterns, and self-esteem. What good are increased personal and ministry relationships between whites and blacks if colorism shapes our view of which blacks are deemed acceptable? Have we really made racial progress in the acceptance of black women's natural hair when only women with naturally curly and decidedly not kinky or African textured locks are featured in advertising? Is it actually a triumph when the Asian American women in television and film all appear to have had eyelid surgery, or when models from diverse ethnicities actually have the same phenotypically European features? Light eyes, fair skin, aquiline noses, and long straight hair. If racial reconciliation counts it as progress when a man of color loves whiteness more than his darker skinned sister, it is not racial reconciliation at all, but rather a poorly disguised continuation of white supremacy. Thank you.